Good morning and good evening and good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are in the world. Gives me great pleasure to host this ECMONet presentation. I think it's the fourth one in our series. My name's Aidan Burrell. I'm an intensivist in Melbourne and work at Monash University and work with work in the executive at the ECMONet. It gives, as I said, a great pleasure to welcome you all. Today, we're going to hear from Ary Serpa Neto, who's going to talk about a new outcome measure when designing clinical trials in ECMO. I'm just going to quickly mute someone. Who is that? There we go. Today I'm going to welcome Ary to talk about the dose outcome measure for ECMO trials. A quick introduction about Ary, because he'll obviously go into all of it in more detail. We're delighted to have Ary working with us at Monash University as a Deputy Director of the ANZIC-RC, and also Ary's an intensivist who works at the Austin Hospital here in Melbourne as well. Ary originally came from Brazil and has developed a great network of collaborators and researchers working in pulmonology. Following Brazil, he moved to Amsterdam and did his second PhD looking at anesthesiology and intensive care. He came to Australia, I think, 5 years ago now, Ary. And has been 6 years ago, and has been an amazing addition to the group with us in Melbourne. He's incredibly experienced. I won't go into all of the different things he's done, but really for this, his experience in mechanical ventilation, in trial design, in statistics, all has been really important in leading to this work. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ary. I guess one other thing, so I'll just mention is format. So Ary will do a presentation. There'll be a chance for questions at the end, and then we will have a potentially quick final point to make at the end. But yes, I'll hand it over to you now, Ary.
Great. Thank you very much, Aidan. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you and the ECMONet for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I'll just see if I can share my screen. Can you just please confirm that you can see my screen? Can you see it?
No. Can you see it? Can anyone else see it? I currently can't.
Yes, I can see it.
You can see it? Okay. Great.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Right.
Good. So my idea today is to discuss this new outcome that we are developing for studies, not necessarily only on ECMO, but we validated it on ECMO. And also it's important to mention that this is our work in collaboration with a lot of different people. So of course the ECMO team and from the ECMO program, from the ANZIC-RC, Carol, Lisa, and all the project managers working on that, with the statisticians from the Berry consultants and also from the Department of Biostatistics from Monash, and some consumers of our consumer panel. So no disclosure related to this talk. And my idea today is to start discussing the problem with outcomes that we have today when designing studies in critical care. Then describing the dose, which is the Daily Ordinal Scale for patients on ECMO, how it was defined and developed, the validation, the modeling, the impact on trial design, which I think is the most important part, and some, of course, limitations, and just provide you with a practical example on how to approach and how to design a study using this outcome. So starting with the problem, I think, I don't know you, but I think that one of the biggest issues that we have at the moment with clinical trials in ICU is the selection of outcomes. I think we are completely crazy at the moment with the outcomes that we select for our clinical trials, with several different problems. So first, we were really bad at the beginning with trials that were not relevant to consumers, they were not relevant to stakeholders. We are better now. I think we can still be better. I think we can still involve our consumers even more, and I think we can do this better. But I think now the main issue that we have at the moment is that we select outcomes that are first are hardly influenced by the interventions that we investigate, and second are very distant from the intervention that we investigate. So very often we assess interventions that are very like in the early phase of the disease with very short duration, and then we try to investigate or to assess if this short and early intervention affects an outcomes that happen like 90 days later, which is like a long period of time with a lot of concurrent and intercurrent states and events, and leading with, we know, like, and we see now with a lot of neutral trials and a lack of positive interventions in the ICU. So this is just one systematic review reporting that from among like more than 100 clinical trials in critical care, only 24% of these trials reported patient-centered outcomes. So this is already a problem. So the majority of the trials reported outcomes that were not considered patient-centered, which is a big issue. And among trials reporting patient-centered outcomes, so 27 trials, 78% of the trials reported mortality as the outcome. So we all know that mortality is the preferred outcome in most of our clinical trials, but we also know that mortality, there are a lot of problems with mortality. So first, as you can see here, this is a very nice systematic review published like more than 10 years ago, but I really recommend you like reading this paper. It's really nice. You can see this is like an investigation of around 146 clinical trials in ICU, and they investigated like factors or characteristics associated with a positive outcome or a positive study. And they found that only 10% of the studies reporting mortality as an outcome had a positive result, reported like a difference or a benefit in mortality with a determined intervention. The number of trials with positive findings increased when an infection-related outcome was used. And this is mainly, for example, ventilator-associated pneumonia, with all the criticism that we can have with an outcome like VAP. But like this is just to show that using a different outcomes, there was an increase in the percentage of trials reporting a positive finding. 43% when a ventilation-related outcome was used, and mainly these will be ventilator-free days, and 29% with a composite outcome was used. And this is just to show that despite mortality being the most used outcome in clinical trial, the percentage of trials finding any benefit in mortality is very low. And there are several reasons that we will discuss, but it's really important for us to consider that. Of course, there are other like characteristics that are associated with positive trials. So as you can see in this regression model, a single center trial is more likely to have a positive outcome. And I think this is expected because most of the time they are smaller, so they are more imprecise. They have several biases related, especially with the reduction in the heterogeneity of patients, and potentially it's an easier way of finding a consistent treatment effect. And we also know that the main problem is that very often when we replicate single center trials in multi-center trials, we fail to usually find the same signal. And in this regression model, the authors found that RCTs that did not report any funding source and RCTs that did not study a primary mortality outcome, they were significantly more likely to be successful, suggesting, and I think the most important thing for us is that most of the time we use mortality, we are unable to show a positive finding. Several reasons that I just want to highlight this one. This is like a study called Lotus Fruit, which I collaborated with the Americans back like 8 years ago, where we investigated the feasibility of running a clinical trial investigating the impact of a low tidal volume ventilation for all patients, for all comers in the ICU. So probably if you all are pretty experienced with the ventilation field because of ECMO, you all know that there's a lot of evidence over the last 25 years suggesting a potential benefit with the use of low tidal volumes in patients with and without ARDS. But of course, in patients without ARDS, this evidence is not as strong as in patients with ARDS. However, we have different studies reporting this potential benefit. And together with the Americans, we were thinking about designing this very large cluster study investigating a universal use of low tidal volume ventilation versus a conventional ventilation in patients with acute respiratory failure, not necessarily ARDS. And then together with their statisticians, David Schoenfeld especially, we started to simulate the number of patients that would be needed to find a mortality benefit using estimates from previous studies. So this is like our study and our systematic review and meta-analysis reporting benefit with this strategy, the ARMA trial, and the Lotus Fruit pilot. So this is the estimated mortality benefit with low tidal volume. And as you can see, like if we want to replicate this and do a study to investigate a potential benefit of this strategy, we will need to randomize more than 100,000 patients. And even if we exclude like the top sites, and why are we doing that? So imagine that the top sites are the sites where they already implement low tidal volume ventilation. So if we do a cluster crossovers versus usual care, the gradient or the effect treatment will be lower or will be smaller in these sites because they already have, as usual care, an intervention that potentially reduces mortality. So even if we exclude these sites and we keep only the sites that don't provide low tidal volume as usual care, so we amplify the effect, you still see that the number of patients that we need is 66,000 patients. So theoretically, it's possible for us to show that tidal volume is associated with probably a 2% or 3% reduction in mortality compared to usual care, but we will need more than 60,000 patients to show that, which is unfeasible. And this happens because you all know that the effect or the sample size that you need in clinical trial is related to using a binary outcome as mortality, is related to the event rate in the control arm, to the effect size that you want to show, and of course to the power and the significance level or the alpha of your study. As you can see here, for the same effect estimate, so get here like a relative risk reduction of 10% or a risk ratio of 0.90. If you have like a reduction in the incidence of the outcome in the control arm, you see that the number of patients that you need to enroll is much higher. And this is the problem with mortality in critical care. We know that mortality in critical care is reducing. In some settings and some populations is sitting around 20%, 25%. So to show let's say modest effect, as I think there is just Ines is with the microphone open. Thank you very much. Yeah. So to show a modest effect estimate, when you have a lower incidence in the control arm, you need much more patients. So what we end up doing, and this is like not because I'm a trialist, a intensivist, and I work with the statistics, but if you discuss with different statisticians around the world, very often, and this is not only in ICU, very often what we end up doing is something that it's called sample size SAMBA, which is very well defined, and it's simply the fact where it's always important for us to remember that when we do power analysis or sample size estimations, very often, unfortunately, we have to inflate the effect size that we expect up to the point where we find the number of patients that we are able to enroll. And that's true for most of the trials. We all know that. Unfortunately, we don't have like endless funding. We have limited funding, and very often we need to adapt our power calculation.
You always love looking at these European ones. And
sorry, I think Helen. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and we need to adapt the sample size to what it's feasible for us to do. And this is, as I said, it's true. It's true for most of the trials in ICU. This is back with the meta-analysis that I started at the beginning of the talk. You can see they basically compared the expected change in mortality used in the sample size calculation with the observed change in mortality found in the study. As you can see, like there's a huge discrepancy where there was like most of the time we overestimate the effect size in the sample size calculation, or because we really believe that our intervention is so good that we'll be able to provide or we'll be able to affect mortality a lot, or simply because we have to inflate the effect estimate to end up with a sample size that is feasible to be recruited. So you can see here there's a huge discrepancy between the expected change and the observed change. It's less bad when other outcomes are used. So you see, like if the outcome is not mortality, sometimes you can see that sometimes we can have a good match between the expected and the observed outcome, but with mortality we are usually very bad in predicting the effect. So we very often overestimate, and then we end up with an issue that probably you've heard about yet, which is like the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, showing that most of our trials we end up with no effect, or let's say neutral trials. And this is not because the intervention is necessarily neutral. It's because our sample size or our power is not enough to show an effect size smaller than it was designed to show. So a lot of trials in ICU, if you check, I always like to use the example of the Murinon versus dobutamine trial in cardiogenic shock, published in the New England some years ago, DORAMI trial, where they consider in their sample size calculation a very, very big absolute risk reduction in the primary outcome with the use of Murinon, which was, of course, unfeasible with any intervention in ICU, especially with just a changing from dobutamine to Murinon. They found numerically a very important reduction in the primary outcome with Murinon, but the effect estimate was very clinically relevant, but it's still smaller than the effect estimate used in the sample size calculation. So from a statistical point of view, the trial was neutral, despite a reduction of almost, I think, was close to 8% in the primary outcome. Of course, there was like a statistical imprecision on that, but this is just to show an example that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So the absence of a benefit with Murinon in this study is not necessarily the evidence of benefit with Murinon. It's simply because the study was underpowered and the sample size was small. And this happens like in most research fields, and this is a very famous study from John Ioannidis. This is the most downloaded and cited research paper in the world, and this is basically where they discuss like basically the idea of underpowered studies and inappropriate sample size as a problem with reproducibility in critical trials. So the problem is that the majority of our trials are designed to investigate mortality, and most of the time they have ended up in indeterminate or neutral outcomes. Unrealistic assumptions in power calculations, especially in the effect size, play a major role in this. So this also suggests that we need different outcomes that can optimize the balance between power, sample size, treatment effect, and clinical relevance. So what is the dose outcome? What's the daily ordinal scale for patients on ECMO? So we started developing this outcome when we were discussing the best outcome for the RECOMMEND trial, the ECMO platform trial led by Carol Hodgson here in Australia. So initially, the idea was to have death or disability at 6 months as the primary outcome. It's a composite outcome incorporating death or disability defined by the HUDAS score. Or a second option was the HUDAS ordinal outcome at 6 months. So this is just like to show the distribution of the outcomes here. So we started to calculate and simulate with the statisticians from Berry Consultants and from the Department of Biostatistics at Monash, especially Liz Ryan, who participated in this project too. And considering a sample size for an odds ratio of 1.6, which is it's not a modest effect size. It's a very optimistic effect size. We ended up with a sample size that would be, if we use death or disability, 600 patients per subgroup. And if we used HUDAS, would be 500 patients per subgroup. So you all know that ECMO trials are really difficult to be performed, and 600 patients or 500 patients per subgroup would be very, very difficult. So we had to go back to the drawing board and start considering different outcomes. So this is when we developed this outcome, the dose outcome. So dose, the definition is a longitudinal ordinal outcome that captures a patient's daily clinical status following the initiation of ECMO, and it ranks the patient on a 6-point scale from worst to best. It was based on an outcome reported in this trial, the Orbita 2. I really recommend you reading this trial. It's really nice, and the outcome that they use and the way that they explain their outcome is really nice. So we use this as a starting point, and then we developed the outcome discussing with first a consumer advisory committee, including ECMO survivors, researchers, statisticians, health economists, and intensive care and ECMO specialists. And this was also presented at scientific meetings to collect critical appraisal and feedback. And then we ended up with this outcome. So it's a 6-level daily ordinal outcomes measure through 28 days from day of randomization to day 28. And on each day, we have to record the worst status of the patient. So it goes from death, which is the worst outcome, to discharged alive, which is the best outcome. And then you have different states. You have the patient on ECMO. You have the patient in ICU ventilated but not on ECMO. You have the patient in ICU not ventilated. You have the patient discharged to the ward. and you have the patient discharged from the hospital. And of course, it's important to mention that the patients can transition from different states. They can be on ECMO and then they can transition to ICU ventilator. They can transition to ICU not ventilator. They might be reintubated and go back to ICU ventilator. So they can, of course, transition. But death and discharge, they refer to levels that are something that we call absorbing. So patients cannot move once they are in that level. So if they die, they died, of course. And if they were discharged, they were discharged. So readmission is not captured here. So the whole development, the description, then the analysis and the power calculation using this outcome is reported in this paper, published in the Blue Journal. So I also suggest that if you have time, you can read, and we describe everything in the paper. So the dose outcome was developed, it's very important to mention, in collaboration with a consumer advisory committee. It's a longitudinal outcome that captures a patient's daily clinical status using a 6-level scale, and it's measured over the first 28 days following ECMO initiation or randomization. So how did we validate these outcomes? So first we assessed the constructive validity. So we assessed the 2 components. First was the convergent validity. We were simply trying to identify a correlation between the dose outcome and the death or disability. Give me just 1 minute. I just need to see they're knocking. So the convergent validity was assessed as a correlation between the dose outcome and death or disability at 6 months, just to see. And as you can see here in the top graphs or the top panels, there was a good correlation between the dose outcome and death or new disability at 6 months, suggesting a good convergent validity. And then we assessed what we call divergent validity, which is basically trying to find an unexpected correlation that would explain spurious findings. So we tested the dose against against BMI, which is something that we don't expect a correlation. And as you can see, there is a negligible, almost no correlation between dose and BMI, confirming divergent validity. Then the next question was, okay, very nice, dose is potentially good, but is it related with patient-centered outcomes? Is it related to something that is important for patients, for stakeholders, for physicians, for healthcare workers? So using death or new disability at 6 months as the gold standard, remember, this would be the outcome, the original outcome of the trial. We started to investigate the predictive ability of dose in different days. And we found that, as you can see here, from day 1 until day 28, there was a progressive increase in the predictive ability of dose, suggesting that dose was day by day able to predict better death or disability at 6 months. As you can see that after day 28, there was almost no change anymore. So 2 things that we can conclude from this. So first is that dose is a very good predictor of death or disability at 6 months. So despite not being assessed at 6 months, it's a very good predictor. So patients with worst dose, they will have worst outcomes at 6 months. And the second thing is that after day 28, if we continue to measure dose, the gains in terms of prediction the gains are basically negligible. So you can probably stop at day 28. And you can see here that the area under the curve for the prediction is pretty good. It's 0.86 for VA ECMO patients, 0.83 for VV ECMO patients, and 0.93 for ECPR patients, suggesting that a daily assessment of this outcome until day 28 has a very good prediction in relation to death or new disability at 6 months. It also performs well with the independent components of the WHODAS score. Of course, the prediction is not as strong as when including death in the outcome, because death is also a part of the daily with the dose outcome. But you can see that it is still a fair, reasonable predictive power for the independent components of the WHODAS score. So overall, what we can conclude from this first assessment is that those collected up to day 28 performed really well compared with death or new disability at 6 months for all types of ECMO, but especially for ECPR. And what about the statistical modeling and especially the interpretation of this outcome? So this is just a simple way of presenting the outcome. So you can use transition plots, or you can use these spaghetti plots where you simply or Swindler plots, where you simply present every day until day 90, until day 28. It's your choice about the end of the follow-up, where you represent here the different states. So you can see that patients over time, they die. So the number of patients, the mortality rate increase over time. The number of patients off ECMO but still on ventilator, they will of course increase over time as patients will come off ECMO. Same with patients off ECMO and extubated in the ICU. Same with patients discharged to the ward, and same, of course, patients discharged from the hospital. So this is just a way of showing, a very nice graphical way of showing like the different states of dose over time. And you can use these plots. These plots are really, they were used in target trial emulations of steroids in patients with COVID. But it's a bit complex to see, but it's also nice because you can see that all patients started red on ECMO, and then you can see like this patient here was red on ECMO, then this patient had a period of ECMO, sorry, and on ventilator, then a period here of ECMO extubated in the ICU, then a period here where the patient was on the ward, and then the patient was discharged. Some patients, they are different. You see this patient will had a long period on ECMO, then a short period of ECMO on ventilator, and then patient died at the end. So this is just a way of showing different transitions between like the different states of the dose outcome. This is another graphical representation where you can see like the solid dot or dashed lines, they are related to the type of ECMO. And then you have here the different states. So for example, if you get the discharged one, you can see that over time, the patient's discharged increased. And this, of course, is more, it's higher in patients undergoing VV ECMO, it's slightly lower in patients undergoing VA ECMO, and it's much lower in patients undergoing eCPR. But you have all other states in this line plot. Regarding the analysis of this outcome, the best model to use is a model that we call a Markov longitudinal model, which is a model that assess the outcome of the patient, or assess the probability of the patient being in a different state in the next time without taking information from the past into account, just the previous state. So we are planning to use and recommend a Bayesian approach. So and the Markov model, with models the posterior probability of those outcomes for each of the interventions within each domain of the trial. So the end or the effect estimate of this model is something that we call the daily transition odds ratio, where an odds ratio greater than 1 represents that the patient is more likely to be in a better clinical state in the intervention compared to control. And with this, we can also calculate the probability of benefit, which is the probability of having an odds ratio greater than 1. And remember that an odds ratio greater than 1 represents a better clinical state in the intervention group than in the control. Basically, what we do with this model is try to understand if the intervention accelerates recovery compared with the control arm. So for each day and state, with this model, we try to investigate what happens on the following day. So the question is, does the patient remain in the same state, like ECMO and ECMO, or move to a better or worse state the next day? And this is what the odds ratio will represent. It's a model with a lot of power, because basically it uses all the data of the day-to-day transitions, this is why it has like usually higher power than static models. It generates an estimate of the transition probabilities for the entire population. And it, of course, from a statistical perspective, it includes terms in the model that will reflect the effect of each treatment on the transition probabilities. So this is just the model itself that I will not discuss here. But basically, it all deals with this transition, what we call a transition matrix, which is the previous status of a patient, the current status of the patient. So imagine this was the status yesterday, and this is the status today, and then you have the transition probability. So in this example, 2.8% of the patients on ECMO yesterday died today. 1.9% of the patients ventilated yesterday died today. 87.7% of patients on ECMO yesterday are still on ECMO today. So this is just the matrix of transitions. And on each day, given the current status that the patient is, what is the probability to move to a different level of the outcome on the next day? This is what is estimated by the model. This is just an example showing real-life data or real-world data from Excel, from our ECMO registry. You can see, for example, here using day 4 to day 5. So you can see that 2% of the patients on ECMO on day 4 died on day 5. 86.7% of patients on ECMO on day 4 remained on ECMO on day 5. 10.8% of the patients on ECMO on day 4 were off ECMO and on ventilator on day 5. So this is just like we basically estimated all probabilities here in this matrix, and then this is used in the model to estimate the daily odds ratio. You can see here that for day 90, the transition is almost none, because the patients most of the time already reached their final outcome. And you can see here that as we said, death and discharge, they were all absorbing states. They were always like 100% patients cannot change. And it's very important, like in different power calculations and simulations, we found that using this idea of daily odds ratio, assessing daily states, it's better and it's very different and provides more power than using a static odds ratio, which is basically like, imagine assessing the ordinal state at day 28, and then what happened with the patient at day 28 is on ECMO, is discharged, is on ventilator, and then calculate a static odds ratio. This is very different because the daily odds ratio is applied every day. So the effect is accumulated over 28 days, which results in more power. Because you have more data, the daily odds ratio will be always smaller. It will be very close to 1, and it will be smaller than the static odds ratio, but it will be much more precise. And this is like when you have a very large amount of data, your effect estimate tends to be smaller, but the precision tends to be higher, which is good. The mapping, which is basically how does the daily odds ratio correlates or associates with the static odds ratio. Of course, this mapping depends on different distributions of these probabilities. But in general, based on our simulations, a daily odds ratio of 1.2 translates to a static odds ratio at day 28 of 1.5. So a very good effect size for a patient on VA ECMO at day 28. And of course, we can do this for different studies, trying to facilitate the interpretation of the readers when reading a trial with a daily odds ratio. So how to interpret this and how to measure the effect and how to report. So the idea is to always report as the daily transition odds ratio, calculate the posterior probability of benefit, which is the posterior probability of an odds ratio greater than 1. And this will represent an increase in days with less organ support on the intervention compared to control, which is an accelerated recovery. We can also report the state occupancy probabilities, which is the probability of being in a particular clinical state on a particular day. And the idea is to do that for patients on day 28. So on day 28, the percentage of patients on ECMO, still on ECMO, the percentage of patients not on ECMO but on the ventilator. And then you can also provide a static odds ratio to complement the interpretation and report of the trial. And we can also report the number of days spent in a particular state and calculate the difference. I will show an example in the last slides. So regarding the analysis, the idea is to use a Bayesian Markov longitudinal model to estimate the daily transition odds ratio, and an odds ratio greater than 1 will represent an increase in days with less organ support on the intervention group compared with the control. So what is the impact on trial design and power calculation? So as you can see here, the daily odds ratio or the longitudinal dose always result in higher power than other comparisons. So let's use the purple ones here. So the solid line here is the daily odds ratio. It's the daily dose. This line here, the dashed and the dotted lines, they represent the static dose, and they represent simply mortality as we use. So you can see that for the same, let's get here 200 patients. For a similar effect estimate with 200 patients, the power for mortality is 80%. The power for a static dose is close to 96, 95, and the power for a daily dose is close to 100%. So it always results in more power than the other measurements. Considering, for example, this is a simulation considering 400 patients per arm and an odds ratio of 1.20, which is a moderate effect, it's a realistic effect. If we use longitudinal dose, the power is 94% in VA ECMO and 91% in VV ECMO. If you use a static dose, it's 90% and 84%. And if you use 28-day mortality, it's 56 and 36%. So much higher power with longitudinal dose. And we know the longitudinal dose associates very well with a patient-centered outcome, which is death or new disability. So basically, using different simulations in a 2-arm trial, this could easily mean saving like 500 to 900 patients in total sample size using the dose compared with 28-day mortality. And compared with the static dose at day 28, the longitudinal dose will usually increase power by up to 11%. So it's an outcome that very consistently will result in higher power than the traditionally used outcomes. So based on our simulations, those provided a very substantial savings in relation to sample size compared to mortality and static dose. So what are the limitations? So first is that we need to get longitudinal daily longitudinal data, and you all know that collecting daily longitudinal data can be logistically challenging and resource intensive, and of course it increases the likelihood of missing data. But this can be addressed using just simply date of start and date of stop. Instead of having to go every day and select specific states, you can basically say that the patient was on ECMO from day X to day Y, then on ventilator from day Y to day Z, so you can only report the dates. Of course, analyzing daily longitudinal ordinal outcomes, they often requires more complex statistical models, and this is why it's very important to have the input of our statisticians, and this is why I'm mentioning again Liz Ryan from the Department of Biostatistics and the Berry consultants. And of course, I think this is the most relevant thing for us as clinicians and healthcare professionals. Interpreting and communicating this outcome can be very complex, and it's harder than simply reporting a reduction in mortality or an increase in ventilator-free days. And determining their clinical relevance and their meaning to patients and clinicians can be challenging, but we have some suggestions. So overall, those provide a substantial savings in relation to sample size in simulations, but of course does not come without costs, and we have limitations. So I just want to finish with a practical example, and again, this is in the supplement of the paper that I mentioned in the Blue Journal. So this, in the supplement, we provide a hypothetical future clinical trial where we describe first how to describe your outcome, and second, how to describe the statistical analysis. So first, how to describe the sample size calculation, how to describe the statistical analysis, and how to describe the report and the effect estimate and the results of your statistical analysis. We also provided examples of how to report the data. So this is just one example. So your table of outcomes in a clinical trial can be like that. So you can report. So our idea is to report for the primary outcome the level of dose as a mean score, which will be the mean dose score over 28 days. And then you can report as mean and standard deviation. And you will report the daily transition odds ratio from the Bayesian Markov model and the probability of benefit. Then you can report here the median days on ECMO, median days on invasive ventilation, median days in ICU, not ventilator. So the median days in each one of the states of the dose, and this is much easier for the clinicians to interpret. So you can simply report the median, and then you can report the absolute difference to see where the difference is if any. And then you can report the static assessment at day 28. So what is the level of organ support at day 28? What is the dose score at day 28? We can report the mean and the standard deviation, and then we can report the static odds ratio for the day 28 only. Remember that this is for an accumulation of data over 28 days, and here is just for the day 28. And then together with that, we can report mortality at day 28, the number of patients on ECMO at day 28, the number of patients in ICU but not ventilated at day 28. So all the states of the dose, but now at day 28. And we report just at the number of events, the percentage, and as absolute difference. So with this table, you can report your primary outcome and get all the benefits from that from a power perspective, but you can also provide like different assessments that will improve the interpretability and make it easier for clinicians to understand what you are actually reporting. So just to finish, to re-emphasize that we have a problem in critical care trials with the outcomes that we select. As we discussed, very often mortality is not the best outcome because it's unrealistic to find, it's unrealistic to power a trial to find a reduction in mortality. And if you want to be realistic, you need a lot of patients that we probably won't be able to recruit. especially in ECMO, where it's a very difficult population to enroll in clinical trials. The dose is a good alternative. It was developed with consumers. It was discussed in scientific meetings. It's a longitudinal outcome assessing the daily status of the patient on a clinical scale of 6 levels. We can limit the collection of the data to day 28. It provides more power than other measurements, and we have ways of reporting this to make it easier for clinicians and for readers to understand. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions and to discuss this with you. Thank you very much, Ed.
Ary, that was brilliant. I'm sure everyone online will agree. It was a tour de force. I thought I wanted to say, covering, not only the challenges more broadly of developing outcome measures for trials, but also some really nice practical solutions to that problem. So I think, Ary, that was really fantastic. We have some time for some questions. While people are just gathering their thoughts, I'm just going to kick it off. Ary, you mentioned a few times the issue of developing a new primary outcome and bringing the clinicians and consumers and getting everyone to understand that. I know that this has been an issue in one of the other trials I'm involved with, where a similar outcome measure was developed. And when discussing with consumers and clinicians, people didn't feel like they were going to change practice based on that because they just weren't familiar with it. What are some things we can do? How do we convince people when you develop a whole new system and methodology of developing outcomes? How do you convince people to actually change practice based on a new outcome that they're not familiar with?
Yeah, it's a very important question, Ed, and I think this would be the major thing for us to deal with when we report the findings of the first trial using this outcome. And we know that clinicians, they are very reluctant sometimes to change their practice, even when we show something very easy to interpret with a traditional outcome, traditional intervention, and they still oh, my practice is different, here is different. They always find a reason to say that this is not the case. So, and this will be even harder when you have a difficult outcome like this, where it's not easy to interpret. But I think the best way is always about education, communication, discussion, and of course, involving them in the solution. So I think it's really important to involve the clinicians, the consumers, and especially clinicians at the bedside. Say, look, we have this problem. If we continue like that, we'll not get anywhere. We won't be able to reach any point. We won't be able to do anything. What do you think of this? We have this. Would you be happy to consider changing our practice if we find that the intervention is beneficial on that outcome? And so I think it's all about education, communication. It's discussing this during conferences. And I think cardiology, even oncology, they are as I always say, cardiology and oncology, they are great fields for us to learn from. They are already doing that for a while. So several outcomes used in cardiology, in oncology, they are not mortality. They are not something that we are very fixated in ICU, like mortality or very hard outcomes like that. Some of them are it's a win ratio composite outcome of different things, which sometimes probably if you discussed win ratio 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of clinicians will say, oh, no, this is very strange. And now they understand. They say okay, the win ratio is the composite outcome with the hierarchical levels, and we can also report each level and understand where the effect is. Even the orbiter too, it's a very nice study with a very different outcome, which was, from my understanding with my wife, who is a cardiologist, and discussed with other cardiologists, was well accepted. So I think it's all about education, communication, and of course involving clinicians and consumers in all steps to make them feel listened, and it's important, more importantly, to use their opinions and to take their opinions in consideration, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Excellent. Thank you, Ary. Any other questions from anyone? I saw your hand up before. Is that dropped? Or you still have a question?
I guess it was a little comment, just echoing what Ary said. I guess I wonder, one of the things with these sort of complex statistical models that have a lot of power is I guess one of the risks is we end up finding something that has a high posterior probability of benefit, but is a complex, expensive intervention, which, while it has a statistically detectable benefit, translates into a very small meaningful clinical benefit. And I think I wonder if sort of when some advice on how to power your trial so that it's going to translate into a meaningful difference in the patient important outcome. So, specifying that, an odds ratio of 1.2 for the daily transition thing is sort of the lowest end of a score that would be likely to provide a clinical benefit. And obviously that will depend on the kind of invasiveness, complexity, and cost of the intervention for a given trial.
Yeah, I think this is very important, like what always mentioning, because I think like it's something that I'm always discussing too with Paul Young about that. It's different to do like a trial where you are investigating a new drug, very expensive, with a safety profile still not known in a very specific population, and do a trial of something that we do all the time at the bedside, but some clinicians prefer to do in a way, some clinicians prefer to do in another way. And so the way of interpreting this, the effect estimate expected, the safety profile, the power, even like the significance level should always be discussed that represent different situations. And so I think this is something that we fail a bit. I think overall, but especially in ICU, like to consider these nuances and the impact of these differences when assessing our clinical trials. And it's like, okay, very, very, of course, in a naive interpretation, but very simple, like saying that a new drug costing like millions of dollars and with some safety issues, the impact is in reducing mortality by 2%. So this is different from something very easy and simple and cheap that we do all the time, showing the same reduction in mortality. The interpretation and the uptake of the intervention is very different, and this should be accounted when we discuss findings and studies. I agree 100%.
Yeah, great. Any other questions from anyone? I did see Lisa online. She might have dropped off, who was involved with developing this. Ari, just a simple question. So what do you do? How do you account for people that are, for example, on ECMO who are extubated? How do you deal with that in the outcome? Is there a hierarchy or
They will, from a dose perspective, they will be considered on ECMO because it's always the worst, let's say the worst state. So for example, if you have a patient was on ECMO up to like, I don't know, 1 p.m. and then the patient was decannulated and then the patient was just ventilated, is the worst state of the day. So the patient will be considered on ECMO for that day. And in your example, because the patient was extubated, we discussed about creating maybe a category of on ECMO, not ventilated, but basically most of the simulations we've done, like it's not major impact if you just consider on ECMO anyway. So this is why, but in your example, the patient will be considered on ECMO.
Yeah. Okay, good. Just check the chat. So I think, yeah, we would love to have your slides if you're happy, and we can check the links to publications you mentioned. That would be great.
Of course. If you, I'll just ask if you can, after the talk, just send me an email just to remind me of, just please share the slides and I will send my slides.
Right.
Pleasure.
The only other thought I had, so I just probably time for one more question.
Of course.
If there's no other, I wondered about, I liked your example at the end showing a dummy table of how you would interpret, a trial. And I wondered if there's an opportunity for us to, for example, look at another randomized controlled trial where we have the data, where we could actually publish it using the dose and just get people starting to familiar with it. And I was somewhat selfishly just thinking of Blender because we do have the data, but I mean, we could pick any study that we have randomized control, randomized patients where we have the dose score. Why don't we publish that? And that way we can start the discussion even before we go on to the next study.
Yeah. It will be great. I'm very in favor of that. I'm very happy to support and help. I think if we have clinical trials where we have the daily status of the patient up to day 28 is enough, is what we are planning to do. We're very happy to work with the other statisticians and prepare like a paper. But I think it would be really nice. It's a great idea.
Great. Well, why don't we finish a little bit early? Just if on behalf of everyone who's joined today, Ary, it was absolutely brilliant. These ECMONet lectures are really exciting, and I think this really has added a real another flavour to what we've done, and I really appreciate your time, Ary. So thank you.
It's a pleasure.
We will. I think we can send some emails out with that information. And so on behalf of everyone, I just draw it to an end. The final thing I haven't done is to thank Lauren, who's actually done all the work behind this. I'm not sure if Lauren's still online, but she has supported all of this in the background. So a big thank you to Lauren as well.
A pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to participate and always available if you need.
Thank you, Ary. Okay.